today's guest, Andreas Schmitz.
It's a question of how do you approach and work with the customer, and how do you treat a customer, and what is the impression or the status a customer has in the overall organization, actually not just in the commercial team. And I think that's a key that you keep. It's easily said, right? Keep the customer in mind when you do something, but not only keep them in mind, but really have them in the discussion, right? Have them co-design what you're doing. I think that's a key which SAP, Roche on the diagnostic side as well, and also NanoTemper does, involving customers really early on, and not necessarily ask them what you need, because they will only tell you what you need, what they need, what they know. But sometimes they are trying to find a solution and they don't know how to solve it yet. So if you observe the customers and talk to them and really trying to understand them, and I think that's the key also in commercial colleagues working in the sales in the field, trying to get to know what is the real problem you're trying to solve. And you need to be close to the customers to do that. And then have the overall organization behind you, R&D, production, development, HR, finance, also understand what is the need of a customer. Because then you can really focus and try to deliver a solution that fits the needs. Maybe the customer has never talked about that specific solution, but at the end, it doesn't matter if it helps.
Andreas is a basketball player and an executive in the HR field and worked at SAP and Roche, so at big multinational corporations, and led teams up to more than 300 people. Now he is at NanoTemper Technologies, a biotech company, startup, 250 people, starting getting through the roof. They're already very, very, very successful. And we talked about many areas of leadership management, like principles, compensation, how certain teams are designed in a certain way, what are the analogies towards sport teams, and many other topics, how to build portfolio structures in companies to manage big projects in parallel. So if you are up for a lot of knowledge and insightful discussions, then tune in.
Then you can build trust, and then you can spend less time communicating and more time just getting shit done.
Then I went home and thought about this sentence.
We basically put it on the table.
Hiring takes time. People are trained.
How to objectively judge certain situations.
It's very, 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 very hard to change things.
That was the learning.
Entrepreneurs with
To
empathy.
the people side.
Hi, Andreas. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So how should we start? Maybe tell us a bit more about yourself, who you are, and what you're passionate about.
I can do so, thanks. Yeah, my name is Andreas Schmitz. I'm, how do I start best? Well, I'm living in Starnberg, near Munich, let's say it that way. Originally, I'm from Cologne. I'm working in the field of HR. Right now, I'm the head of HR or head of people for a company called NanoTemper Technologies. It's a modern, mid-sized company. It's a startup-like, I would say, and we're currently in the phase to prepare to scale. But previously, I've been working for 20 years in larger corporations, always in the function of HR. Lastly, at Roche, a company in the diagnostics and pharmaceuticals industry, responsible for HR in all of Germany, with about 17,000 people. And before that, I was at SAP in the software sector, also as an HR person, HR business partner in various functions, working out of Palo Alto and in Walldorf, the headquarters. Originally, I'm from Cologne, and now, living with my family over here in the Munich area and enjoying ourselves.
Nice. And in SAP, you also worked with Stefan, I guess, right? Stefan Ries?
That is correct. I started as an intern, and I was lucky to first start with Stefan working in his front office, more or less. I didn't have a classical front office back then, but I had the chance to work with him there and learn from him my beginnings, and still profiting from his insights back then.
That was funny, because I think this is also how we got to know each other, right?
Yeah.
Because of the episode with Stefan, how small the world is.
Yeah, exactly. I noticed that one, and I saw the LinkedIn comment and watched the show, and that's why I reached out to you, and then we got to talk to each other. Yes.
Yes, and we already had very insightful conversations, especially what I really was curious about and also excited about, what you told me about your current role at NanoTemper Technologies. Maybe we start with just tell us a bit
Sure.
more of the company and what's the purposes? Because I think it's really the next thing.
Yeah, it's a cool company and a cool product, and a good purpose behind it. I think that was also something that was important to me. And working before that already in the pharma industry, which sometimes doesn't have the best reputation, but at the end it's something, especially in the Corona times, we saw that it's needed. And when deciding for a change, and that was still important to me. That is a company that has a purpose, a vision, and the vision of NanoTemper is great. So we're helping to create a world where every disease is treatable, right? And we are a company that provides instruments or tools to pharma research organizations, being it pharmaceutical companies or also other institutions which are in the field of drug discovery and development. And it's a company that has been out there for 14 years, and it has been maybe going a little bit different way than other startup companies, with not being funded by any VC companies or other investors, but it's purely based on profitable business, and it has been growing ever since. It's still in the founders' hands, and they're working as the CEOs. And I came on board as part of the newly established executive team to prepare ourselves to scale. And we are at a size right now which is somewhat critical, 250 employees, where you cannot manage it all alone anymore, right? Which above the number of 150, I think the new number, it's not possible to know anybody anymore, or know all of them anymore with first name or with backgrounds. And then we decided to put in this layer, this structure, and now we are actually really preparing to how do we best make sure that we can deliver on the requirements that our customers have and grow with that. And I think culture plays an important role in how we set up our organization, and that's also why I came in, as I saw the opportunity to shape really something great.
Did they headhunt you?
No, not really. I mean, it's a funny story how I came there. I think I first reached out to them, but not because I was looking for a job, but because I was I thought I can help them to find somebody. They had a posting as head of HR. I was at Roche. I was pretty happy, and I am working with some startup companies. And when I saw the posting and it was out there for 3 months, and LinkedIn kept on pinging it and bringing it up, I said, it looks like a cool company. Why can't they find anybody? And I reached out to Stefan and Philip, the two CEOs, and asked them, hey, I saw your posting. What's going on? Why can't you find somebody? Maybe I can help you. I have a network of people. And that's the first time we talked, and I couldn't find somebody for them, I must say. So that was because the strategy was still a little bit up in the air, and maybe it wasn't that clear what they were looking for. So I paused it, and we didn't have any touch points until I think almost a year after, when I was saying, after 20 years, large corporations, I would like to do something more, creating something from scratch, or almost from scratch, scaling something, being responsible for the end-to-end value chain of human resources, of people. And they came back to my mind, and funny enough, they didn't have somebody after a year. So I started discussions with them, and we found a way that make perfect sense for all of us. And I'm pretty happy that it worked out and that I'm here now for the last 8 months.
And how is the difference for you at 11 years at Roche and now going into a small startup? But to be honest, in the startup world, 250 employees and 14 years on the market, it would not be a small startup. Maybe they would even say it's getting a scale up.
Yeah, it's an established business, you could say. But for me, it feels like startup. It feels like a different environment. But you're right. I mean, it's not that we are under the same pressure of some startups that are there or have the same growth pains. I mean, with different growth pains, but not the same one as a company that was founded 1 or 2 years ago with is on a different path. But well, as you said, for me, it feels super interesting, exciting, and engaging, but it's also sometimes frustrating, as everywhere, because it's you expect some things to be there, and funny enough, the things you expect are not there. And let me give you an example. So every time. When I joined NanoTemper, I was aware that this is a different environment. I was aware that I don't have 200 employees as I used to have before in my team. Actually, there were 5 back then, or 6. And Philip and Stefan already told me at the beginning, well, we need you to work too, right? You cannot just manage and lead. You need to be working. So yeah, that's what I would like to do also. But every process you're looking into, you find that there is no process, or that there is something that might not be 100% adequate for what the company really needs, right? So the company had values out there, for instance, right? It is something that was out there, was published, but when talking to the employees and to the colleagues and getting to know each other, I found that, well, the values that are out there on the webpage is absolutely not what you're telling me here right now. It's much cooler what you're telling me than what's out there. How come? And that was the starting point where I saw that there is a lot in there. There's so much potential in the company which is not visible from the outside. So I actually didn't know that. I saw the glowing eyes when talking to people, also in my interviews, one of the reasons I joined. And this is still true when I talk to people here, but it's kind of difficult to show that to the outside. So we're underselling us, I think, on the market right now. And this is something I haven't seen in a corporate life for the last 18, 20 years, that pretty much everybody you talk to is engaged and committed. I mean, you find committed people everywhere, but not that like 90% of people is on that level of engagement. And that's really something that engaged me. And from a frustration perspective, yes, you can imagine that if you're used to processes and you're used to getting some structure, and you're finding that this is not the case, meaning that you need to develop everything from scratch more or less, or decide if there's a process necessary, this is something that puts you under some sort of pressure to not overdo it. And that's where we are right now, to still keep this startup mindset, meaning also, well, startup, or scale up, as you said, not pulling in too much of a process perspective, but rather work by practices or work by principles that people can still make their own decisions based on where the company wants to go.
I love that. I will also have a guest, Eva. She worked at a client, Taxfix, as a chief people officer. And once we had a people team offsite, then she wanted to, when she started, make a presentation of how she thinks about organizations and also people teams. And one of the top principles she shared was principles over processes. And
Yes.
first of all, a lot of people did not really understand what does this mean. And I think it's also not so easy to make decisions from it if that's a bit new to you, because there are some people in the organization who are maybe used to do certain things always in the same way and by how it's documented. But sometimes maybe then you need to change stuff, and then you have a new principles or defined principles, and things that were maybe correct in the past are not correct now anymore, or maybe not the best solution anymore, right?
Yeah. I think the working with principles requires a level of maturity you need to gain first, because it's not prescribed what you have to do. You have to apply it to the current situation, and that's why I think it's in a fast changing environment, regardless of being startup, scale up, large company. Whenever there's something that is not known or more chaotic almost, or volatile, a principle can help you more, right? Because you can apply it to the current situation, even though it might sometimes be more critical, because you're putting in charge, you put yourself in charge while doing that. You cannot say, well, I just followed the process, right? And the process, of course, you need processes when there's repetitive work, or you just need to ensure a certain standard. But the working with the principle, also defining a good principle, and making sure that sometimes this tension of principles, I mean, you can pull up principles that speak against each other, and still it is necessary sometimes to do that. And there's a nice book which is called Principles, by the way, by I forgot the name, an author in the US, and somebody who owns a venture capital fund. Need to look it up, and he adds, or he had made this as a practice in his company, to add principles while he leads. So every time there's a decision being made, they check, did we follow the principles? Yes. And if not, well, which principle did we miss? Do we need to add another principle because we made a choice which does not follow the current principles? So they have a list
from Ray Dalio?
Yes, Ray Dalio, exactly. Thank you. Yeah. So I found that really fascinating. I'm just wondering how complex it gets if you add on principles one after the other, but I think the general approach is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think they manage the biggest or at some point manage the biggest amount of money as a fund out there. So crazy. I think it's Bridgewater.
That's behind it, exactly. And I think the tension was when he was giving away his executive leadership role and trying to have his leaders do it after, but following his principles. Of course, that didn't quite work, right? But I think principles is something that I'm still keen in. Also for NanoTemper, I think it would fit, and it fits, but it requires exactly that level of maturity. You need to bring people closer to what it is not, and how to work with it.
What is the most tangible principle for you out of the book?
Out of the book, well,
can also just be a general principle, but I think there are a lot of cool principles in there.
Well, there is, first of all, I think the way how you structure principles, and that's something I learned at Roche, is interesting, because you say it's something is more important over something else, but it's not the other. So let's say we would like to be flexible, and therefore we prefer outsourcing over internal staffing. Let's say it that way, right? This might not be the best example, but it doesn't say you're not hiring, but it says whenever you have the chance to outsource something, to be more flexible, to keep the flexibility, you would prefer that over the internal hiring, even though it might be a cost disadvantage, because you value flexibility over that, right? And I think that's the nice thing, that it doesn't necessarily prescribe you not to do something else, but you have to weigh it. It also says, it gives you to a consideration which dimensions you have to consider, right? It's something where we had a principle in the past which I didn't find that helpful, but it was we look at problems in a holistic and in an individual way or something. And that was something where I thought, well, we look at it at a holistic over a specific individual way. So, and there I was wondering, what does it mean? So, of course, I look at the bigger picture, and I look at it, and I'm trying to solve the problem. And here we are already, right? It gives you the nudge to look at it holistically. It doesn't say that you should not solve the problem, but that's what I found in principles interesting, how you can phrase them to just keep on nudging people to think about it a certain way, think about things a certain way. Do I have an overall principle that I prefer? Well, I think the principle above process is a nice principle, right? So that one I would almost say is a key when you work with them.
Yeah, I would agree. I also think that the foundation of really high, maybe not high performance, but teams who really deliver high output and are fast, they have a certain level of trust and also a certain level of principles that they can operate without always really communicating to each other. They know how they would operate, and therefore this non-verbal communication through principles, or that you already know how you should operate in a certain way to get things done. I think that's also part of the value of principles, that I see that in teams, that when they have certain principles they stick to, then they are really fast and also effective.
I agree. So once they have established that, they're really fast and quick and more effective. I think getting there, as you said, it requires a certain level of trust. And I think the level of trust is underestimated, how much you really need to trust each other to come to that level. And designing principles is a way to gain trust, right? It's something that you need to align, that you need to fight for. And maybe you have a conflict about these principles, because if you really want to use them, you need to be on the same page. You need to be really absolutely clear that, hey, these are the principles we use, and we all commit to these, right? We are all committed, and we challenge each other. Also, if we see somebody's not following them, or if we have interpreted them in a different way, I think that's the key in teams where you come to these great results. The principles is more the tool for me to get there, to really have that established trust, but also to challenge each other for the result's sake at the end.
I agree. And you are also a professional basketballer, or maybe a passionate basketballer.
Yeah, professional would have meant I earned money with it. That's not true. So I never was a professional.
Okay, but like a very dedicated one.
Yeah. I used to play quite a lot. Well, when I was in the university time, and also a little bit after. And of course, basketball is still one of my passions. And I think in the podcast I have with my partner Jose, we talk about it as well. that we are basketball professionals at heart, at least, right? So that's that we would wish we are, and when we're playing against each other, we think we are, but when we are playing against real professionals or have played, then you see who is a professional and who is not.
It's the same for me with tennis.
You should play against Stefan then, maybe, or have you already?
No, not yet, but I think we will, because he has a passion also for tennis and also for handball. And in the podcast, we also talked a bit about dynamics from sports. Do you also see some analogies there in basketball and teams?
Absolutely, I think it's the same. Well, it's not the same, but you can deduct a lot of similarities from it. And I think high performing, or as I like to say, also NanoTemper sustainable high performance has the same basis, and that is also trust. That is having the same principles, how you want to play, and that is you rely on each other, but you also challenge each other. And from basketball, depending on the team, and let's just look at one of the most successful basketball teams back then, the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan. I mean, you could argue about it, and you could say Michael Jordan is the greatest player on earth, which I agree. And some people also say he's a tyrant, right? But what is behind it? Well, he was challenging his teammates to also work as hard as he did. And for that, everybody needs to be on the same page, follow the principle. Yes, we do almost everything to win the championship, and we do what it needs to take. And that's where I think high-performing teams in business sometimes miss out on, are we really on the same page? Do we really want to go into that direction? Are we really want to, let's say, sacrifice something to make that happen, right? And that's, if you don't speak about that, it's always something that lingers around. And when working here with the leadership team in NanoTemper, I think that's something we still need to do. It's something that most executive teams maybe hesitate at some point in time because it requires conflict, and you need to resolve that. And maybe not even resolve it, but you need to have it, and that's important. And that's also important in a basketball team. Or in any sports team, I guess, that you have these kind of principal conversation about the same goal you want to achieve and what you're willing to do that.
In case you like my show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. I agree. And I also see that there needs to be a certain inner drive, and that needs to be aligned with all the other team members, at least, let's say, with 80% plus, that you can also move at a certain pace and a certain effectiveness into one direction.
Yeah, and that's why I think, and actually we're publishing a podcast exactly on that with a former professional basketballer, Chris, and there we discuss it the other way around. So why are professional sports people good for business as well? Why should we hire more actually professional athletes that might not have been the first choice, at least not on the German or European market? When you think about hiring somebody, you're not necessarily thinking about a former professional, either basketball player, soccer player, whatever you like. But if you think about it, what they bring with it, the mindset of winning, the app being on point, being focused at a very specific moment, and always delivering, because otherwise you wouldn't be a professional sports player. If you apply that in business, in let's say a sales position, how important is that, right? When you face the customer, you have to deliver. You have to be performant at that point in time. And you have to keep the pressure up for yourself, but also stand up against the pressure you get. And that's all traits that professional athletes bring along. And sometimes I think in Northern America or in the States, it's more established that these are behaviors that you need in business to succeed. And I think we can use more of that in Germany and the European base as well.
I agree. And what I would like also to understand a bit more, when you look at these big organizations like SAP and Roche, can you tell us a bit more about certain learnings and also maybe failures from your time back then that the audience or people who are listening just also maybe can learn from?
Well, lots of learnings, questions where to start. And usually it's the failures, or it's a failing forward, right? It is something that you have done maybe in a way that you learn to do it in a different way going forward. And that starts already in my time as an intern at SAP some time ago in New York, where I made quite a mistake. I was given some responsibility for the bonus calculations for the team, about 200 employees. I did this on an Excel file. which had quite some interesting algorithms in it, which I programmed. And at the end, it was wrong, right? So we paid more than we had budget, and that was already paid out. So you could have asked the people to pay it back, which is kind of difficult. Or as then SAP did it, and my manager discussed with the head of global marketing, which was a business unit. We just say, well, this is for your extra effort, right? That is a non-intention. But I thought that was in my week number 4, maybe, or 5 when I was there. I thought, well, now I'm going back. I can go back home. But my manager came to me and said, well, Andreas, we gave you the task. We believed you can do it. We didn't help you enough, maybe, but this is on us, right? So you might have made the mistake. So let's in the future make sure that maybe you check with somebody doing these things, but we're not blaming you for it, right? And that was something I learned from a just pure leadership perspective. Yeah, of course, you stand up for your people. If they do a mistake, it's your fault as a leader, right? To some extent. And at least you do not show that to the outside. Of course, you have a serious discussion, but you stop the failure and learn from it.
Did Stefan also get too much bonus?
No, it was just for the global marketing colleagues. So HR was outside. I'm not sure that he knows that, right? So he was theoretically he was the boss of my boss back then. So I'm not sure that it was ever coming to Swiss way. But these are just some learnings. I mean, in big corporations, you have really it's the beauty that you learn a lot, and if you're looking for learning, the resources are just extensive, right? That is something which I enjoyed, and actually looking back at it, I only see how lucky I was to make use of all these, either being trainings and learnings. If you run around with open eyes and engage with some people, you can learn every day from the best people out there, because you have this vast or this deep experience and expertise in big corporations.
And how was it working in New York or Palo Alto and Waldorf?
Yeah, it's a different working style, right? It's funny enough that when you're in Waldorf and in the German headquarters, people talk about what they like and what they dislike with people in the US, or especially in Palo Alto, and the other way around, right? What I let's say a bias I heard in the US a lot was, well, in Germany the people have so much vacation and they're not efficiently working well. And at 6 o'clock at night, we do not see people working anymore. So, and in the evenings, so they're not that they're lazy, but they're relaxed. And then when I'm in Germany, of course, it's the other way around. You say, well, we are working from 8 to 6 or 9 to 6 or whatsoever, but we are really constantly working. And these not maybe lazy Americans, but hey, they might have less vacations, but they're not working all the time. They're chatting all the time with each other, right? So it's blaming each other a little bit from a cultural perspective, and both are right to some extent, but it's not better or worse at the end. I think the output is pretty similar.
Value.
No, exactly. So I think the value overall, there's different styles, working styles, living styles, and they have all their right opportunity, and they have the right place. I think that's what you have to consider from an intercultural perspective, which I, funny enough, studied back then in university, but applying it is a different story. And I think the mindset of risk taking is a different one. I think that's probably the real difference. When you look at Palo Alto and the Bay Area in general, the mindset is more, we take bigger risks with also higher rewards if helpful. And that's something in Germany I'm not seeing to that same extent, which is also something that is you can see from both sides, positive or negative.
And I think that's a key point also when we just shortly connect it to compensation, when we talk about the stock option plans and rewards thing. In Europe, I don't see it really taking off because exactly of that reason.
Well, there's another reason, which is a tax reason, right? Well, so far,
that's also true.
That's being, I think it's being looked at or has been decided. I read it in the news yesterday that maybe there is a different taxation going on stock options for smaller companies. But you're right; it's something which is risk taking or not. Are you okay being paid in something that doesn't exist right now, right? Or do you give that out? And I would say it's a generational topic almost. I'm not so sure that right now it still holds true that is less appreciated if you have really stock options that are that in a company that is somewhat on a growth perspective. But I think what comes against it is also here again, the reward or the expected reward from a US startup is usually higher, right? If a US startup is successful, they have this access to this huge American market already, and then their valuation goes up. And in Germany, it's not that extensive. I mean, it's a big market still, but it's much tougher for startups, I think, at least the ones I work with, to get traction here and to be on the same growth trajectory. Of course, we have some unicorns out there, but compared to the number of companies that are more valuable in the US, it's a different story. And I think that's where people hesitate to really join that company. Yes, do I get stock options? Okay, great. But how much will they be worth then? Is it really $1 billion company back in a couple of years? Or is it just a few million? And then, yes, it's also worth money, my options, but it's not that I can pay my house or my rent from it.
Yeah. So this is why you also should never sacrifice base compensation for stock options if you're in Europe and if it's not the next really big thing.
I agree. That's should always be balanced. I'm not a big fan of variable pay necessarily, but depends a little bit on the roles. I think the mix of base and long-term incentives to some extent is helpful, but stock options might not always be the best option.
Yeah, I agree. And do you see also some patterns or learnings in how you design certain compensation plans or how they were structured in your career?
Oh yeah, they were quite different, and now they're again different because we have a different size, different complexity or non-complexity. But here again, I learned a lot in my days at both larger companies, and they're going different ways, I would almost say, and it depends on also where in the organization, which countries you're in. I mean, at Roche in Germany, you're co-determined. You have an works council. You have unions that affect, of course, the compensation structure, which is being designed on that level, on a tariff agreement level, right? For at least for a certain amount of people. What I found interesting at Roche was that with regards to long-term incentive, you could choose. If you were lucky in Germany, not everybody was in that range, but if you were in the levels that were granted long-term incentives, you could actually choose what kind of incentives you take, how much percentage you take, RSUs, so restricted stock unions, and that's might be a little bit too technical right now, or different kind of virtual stock options. And what was behind it? Well, the one was more higher risk, higher reward, right? And the other one was less risk, less reward, but more stable. And it was left to the employees then to decide which option to take. How do you personally feel about it? And that's something I learned. Even though it might come out to the same, but giving people the choice made them more happy, almost, or more confident that what they do is the right thing. I mean, it's speculation anyway to some extent. Well, I have no clue how much the share price is in 3 years, but I felt I made a contribution because I could choose based on these plans. That was something which I thought was fascinating. And of course, the discussion, and that's a longer discussion, I guess, about variable pay, how much is really useful, for whom is it useful, what do you tie it to, company or organizational results or individual results. I think that's a pretty long debate, and it's a pretty complex topic.
But I agree. There is also a trend overall now, I think, coming with the whole benefits scheme as well, that companies earlier on go way more into self-service benefits. And I think the whole compensation topic post-COVID, as every organizational topic, got more complex. And also, it can create more value because you can play around more depending on your business models and what you try to achieve overall as an organization. Because the world got a bit more flexible, didn't it?
Yeah, it becomes more flexible, and I think there's a risk to it, and that you are trying to do too much, which you cannot administer at almost, right? And I think that's something at NanoTemper right now, compared to Roche or SAP, which has a long list of benefits, right? There's something which was growing over time, and some new things coming on top. And it's hard to stop benefits that are existing, right? So you keep on adding. And at some point, it becomes a landscape where you just are wondering, well, I'm not even sure what these benefits are for, or who's using them, but you need to keep them. NanoTemper, different story, almost no benefits. right? It's almost no benefits. And also compensation-wise, we are starting benchmarking only this year, right, to see how we are, how we're doing. People are looking for benefits, and I think that's the difference, that maybe they cannot do on their own, or that it's not about necessarily the monetary benefit behind it, but something they wouldn't be able to pay for them themselves, because you could also always argue, give you more money, do it yourself. Of course, tax-wise, that might not be the financially best option, but to keep administration low, you could decide that. But then what about those benefits that you couldn't do on your own? Let's say maybe a sounding dry one, but an insurance which helps you or something similar like a private insurance for a company, right? Which you can do for the whole company, and then everybody gets in the appreciation of it, regardless of your health status. So that is something which I believe companies, and we at NanoTemper, look at what are benefits that we can offer that an employee cannot do themselves. And here you end up in an environment which is not as complex anymore as the whole bandwidth of benefits that are out there, because as you said, it's so individual what people prefer, that trying to please everybody will not work in smaller companies, at least, unless you have really smart partners who help you with that. I mean, there's companies out there right now who specialize on that, who have offerings to manage that, but still there is an administrative effort behind it, and you need to watch out to not that it doesn't grow over your head.
Yes, and when we stick to that topic of the overall environment and how does it relate maybe to our profession, can we go a bit into the commercial side of businesses and how it should translate to design or run organizations, or how you should equip managers, or how they should be thinking in terms of principles, in terms of processes, in terms of company stage?
On the commercial side, so sales and marketing.
Yes. Commercial side overall, and also overall strategic side, that we also understand, okay, what are maybe some learnings or also some ideas that worked out well for you in the past, or how you think of it, that a company is also commercially successful.
Yeah.
Because Roche and SAP obviously are, and NanoTemper I know as well.
Exactly. Commercially successful, sometimes more successful than you would have thought. And I think there's a couple of key elements. Of course, there is the product is always there, right? But the product is sometimes exchangeable. Maybe in the environment of Roche, it's not that much exchangeable, because a drug that works against a disease, well, that's then scientifically documented where it works best and where not. But still, it's a question of how do you approach and work with the customer, and how do you treat a customer, and what is the impression or the status a customer has in the overall organization, actually not just in the commercial team. And I think that's a key that you keep. It's easily said, right? Keep the customer in mind when you do something, but not only keep them in mind, but really have them in the discussion, right? Have them co-design what you're doing. I think that's a key which SAP, Roche on the diagnostic side as well, and also NanoTemper does, involving customers really early on, and not necessarily ask them what you need, because they will only tell you what you need, what they need, what they know. But sometimes they are trying to find a solution and they don't know how to solve it yet. So if you observe the customers and talk to them and really trying to understand them, and I think that's the key also in commercial colleagues working in the sales in the field, trying to get to know what is the real problem you're trying to solve. And you need to be close to the customers to do that. And then have the overall organization behind you, R&D, production, development, HR, finance, also understand what is the need of a customer, because then you can really focus and try to deliver a solution that fits the needs. Maybe the customer has never talked about that specific solution, but at the end, it doesn't matter if it helps. And therefore, I think it's so important to keep the customer close, or being close and understand, but not only in the commercial field or the field organization.
And how can I imagine that? For instance, how did it look like at Roche versus now at NanoTemper? Because it's both in the pharmacy industry space. Yeah.
So I would now let's focus on the diagnostic sides of Roche, because that's more comparable to where NanoTemper is in the space. Here, what happened? There were co-creation workshops, right? There was an instrument which Roche has, which was for a lab. It doesn't matter what it was right now, for tissue diagnostics. And it came out that, yes, it was useful, but it would have been more useful. And that was in a workshop with customers who actually worked with it. And we saw what the issue was, meaning we needed to manually enter trays into that machine. So somebody had to take the tray, put it in, then it worked for an hour, then somebody had to take it out again, take the next one with the samples, put it in. And of course, that is not much work, but it's still manual work. You need to do to have somebody do control time-wise, put in a date and a reminder and everything. And how easy is it to develop and build a quick robot that does that? And not meaning that we take away work from somebody, but that wasn't really meaningful work, putting a tray from here to there. So that was some easy fix then to do, to have it more meaningful, that this robot arm puts it there and in here, and not an expensive one, right? And therefore it is that the customer was thrilled, and not only that one customer, obviously that was a problem others had too. And that is an example where I think you need to do more of these co-development perspectives and co-development efforts, and not only then have the sales colleagues in such a workshop, but have production, have development, have R&D in it, so they see what it is, so they have an understanding of, hey, okay, I remember that customer XYZ, how they work. So now when I develop this new instrument, I have that in mind, and maybe I even call them up and ask them, hey, I have to decide X or Y. Can you help me with that? Or what would you do? Or what would help you most? So that's, I think, a key to keep in mind. How do we keep that customer in mind in the overall value chain of a company? And that's the same at NanoTemper. We're working towards being not only a trusted advisor, but also being an expert in the field of what the customer does. And that is also reflected in our employee base. So you can see that quite a lot of people are actually joined us from customers. They were quite engaged with our instruments, and they saw how cool they are and how valuable. And then they thought, well, why not join that company and help others to get the same kind of experience? And that, I think, speaks for itself. So something we need to keep in mind, as I think the customer being number one.
That's really outstanding to do, and I think totally the right thing. And and it is so simple and effective, but many companies just don't do it. Where it's also, I think, important to then still design the organizational structures in a way that you then not get lost, is that also the functions, they need to talk to each other regularly, but not just doing a sure fix update meeting and nobody shows up or has no agenda points. That there is also some kind of a conceptualization on how certain communication is run within the company and what's the impact from it. I see, especially in companies that grow, when they put in the first layer of management, let's say from 150 plus upwards, this gets really bad, because there are new people in the team. They all do the things how they're used to do it, with the old people that were there already and did it in another way. To just align, while growing, the whole organizational management piece to a certain standard doesn't mean that everybody has to do it in the right way, but also based on certain principles, as we talked before. To establish this is key, hard, takes time, and everybody needs to be on the same page and wants to do that. But then you also can you can achieve outstanding accomplishments when you do that as a management team, and also with all the individuals.
I agree, and it is effort to do that. It's a conscious effort you need to put in. I think I agree. What happens, what I've seen at least, is if something gets in the way and it gets hard, or you're facing an obstacle, that you're trying to change course. And I think that's a tough choice you sometimes need to make. Is that obstacle really an obstacle which we need to work around, or do we just need to resolve it and plow through and then get going again, right? And I think in a fast-paced environment, you are sometimes just saying, well, then I go another way, if I cannot resolve it right away. And that's the thing. Well, no, sometimes we need to go into the conflict and get that resolved, or the obstacle, whatever it might be. And especially when it comes to teamwork and cross-functional work and communication, of course, it's way easier to work in your silo, right? To just check the list of things you need to do, and it might be harder to always look left and right what's happening there. But how important is that, right? And I think if you need mechanisms to also reward that to some extent, right? If it's just more work for people, why would they do it? So what's in it for them to do it? I think one is, of course, the pleasure of being successful, doing the right thing. But I think there can be, you can nudge it to a way that is being rewarded and that's seen, that is also appreciated as a company. And that's where we are right now at. We have established these silos, right? As you said, we were growing and trying to make it as efficient as possible, but efficiency is only one dimension. And now it's, how do we again bring these teams together? And some teams have started on that on their own, which is great. And now we need to show, hey, what you're doing is actually wonderful. Keep on doing it and spread the word that this is working.
And you also need to, I also think that I don't like it and many people don't like it. You need control mechanisms. Nobody likes to be controlled.
No,
but
they
they also don't need to feel like it's control. It's more like, hey, there is a certain cadence on when we update each other with certain information. And if something is out of plan or out of what we expected, then we need to take action from it instead of just not mentioning it or not creating the awareness.
It's a little bit of it's discipline, if you want to say it that way. It's a discipline. It requires tenacity to go through it. And I think that's something you learn in large corporations, which is maybe that's sometimes also control in the way of control, but you learn how to deal with it. And this is something you can manage with. Maybe a story, funny enough, we did a cultural assessment last year with NanoTemper, just to see of where are we, what is important to you right now, and what do you think is important going forward in a cultural form.
In case you have any feedback or anything you want to share with me, please send me an email on thomas@peoplewise.com or hit me up on LinkedIn. And in case you really enjoy the show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it.
And there was a result which was quite astonishing. Although if you look at it back directly, it looks like common sense. People were saying and appreciating the freedom to operate how they want to do it, right? So they can pretty much do what they like, and they appreciated that. And they said, going forward, we will still need that. And then there was a different dimension which said, we are requiring more boundary conditions. We think that is right now not enough. So of course, putting these things together, my first thought was, what are you saying? You need boundary conditions, but you like to work individually? Well, yes, of course, right? You within certain boundary conditions, you would like to have that freedom to operate. But if you do not have the boundary conditions, it's chaos. So if everybody does what they think is right, but doesn't have any alignment, if you don't have a strategy, or if you don't have a mechanism, being an objectives and key results or MBOs, doesn't really matter. You're flying around, and there will never be a good output. And employees saw that, and they gave us that feedback. But that requires, again, how do you now keep the independence of people, the individualism, while putting in structures and mechanisms that guide them in a certain way, without having them feel we are just executing what somebody else says. And that's, I think, the key balance again, what we're trying to solve right now. Maybe there's no right or wrong, but I think that's the challenge of current days and current companies.
When we talked about principles, there is something that is exactly spot on what you just said, called Extreme Ownership. It's a book from a US Navy SEAL, Jacko Willings. And it says that people, or the Navy teams, they need to have a certain level of freedom, but within a certain scope of responsibility, and they fully own what's happening in there. And it has to do a lot of things with clearness, proactivity, but also that the people exactly want that and can deal with that freedom, as you said. And this is usually then possible when people are trained in a certain way. Yeah. But then I think you really can operate outstandingly if that is somehow aligned and not, okay, there is one side who likes it a bit differently, the other side who likes it more in another way. If you get all this on the same foundation, then you have a really nice operating system of high performance from a team perspective.
And you touch an important point, though. It requires a training or learning quite extensively to be on that level to do that. And I think that's what I've seen also in large corporations, and both I worked with and others too, that it is, well, now we have to empower our people. So you're empowered now. Go ahead and do it. And then
How, with a magic stick?
Exactly. And so now I put on paper, I sent an email and said you're empowered. So, and then wondering a month later why nothing happened, right? So, and it was fascinating that happened over and over again. Before then somebody came to the conclusion, well, maybe you need to do more than just sending out an email. It is about training, and it's about practicing how to do it. What does it mean? How do you engage in such a way? And when you mentioned that the book, when I introduced the topic of leadership and how do we want to lead going forward at NanoTemper, one colleague in the US sent me a note and said, hey, let's talk. He used to be in the US military, and he has some ideas of what to introduce and what to incorporate in there. So maybe I have that meeting still that's happening next week. So maybe that goes into the same direction as you were saying.
Yeah, I think it's a book that I can really recommend, especially for leader or also HR professionals who need to shape a certain culture where you have knowledge worker that need to achieve things autonomously. Because it's exactly what I think is there to enable that way of working. With a certain level of rules, principles, however you want to call it, that it's also working well. Because there is also the hindsight that when you have then more junior employees, and that's usually with startups the case that you have people who do the job the first time. There, this principle doesn't work that well because they're just lost.
Yeah, it speaks to have a good mix of making sure you have a good mix of people, right? You need the energy and you need the experience to some extent, and ideally you can combine both. Yeah,
because it also comes with expectations. Yeah, if you run things within a certain scope, doesn't have to be management exposure or level, can also be just individual contribution within a field of expertise. Then you also would be expected to drive this area, but also make sure that everything that is business as usual is just running.
Yeah, that's the execution piece, right? That it's you still need to execute, and that's sustainable high performance is to me both. It is making sure it works for the future and it works right now, and usually doing both at the same time. I think that's a challenge. That's a challenge not only to startups but also to other corporations. How do you make sure to have that? Is it even possible to have that switch in mindset on a daily basis almost, right? Or on an hourly basis. So now I'm working on some large future-proof concept, and then the next day I'm doing something that is in the here and now, right? So that's I think something we still need to learn.
One note I still made is that at Roche you said you had a scope of 200 employees at some point?
Yeah, a little bit more, yeah.
Can you talk us a bit through that level of management exposure, on what are the challenges and what are some learnings or best practices?
Yeah, I mean, when I so I did the what might some people call chimney career. So I always was in HR. So I was a global business partner, so consulting people. Then I was heading or had the responsibility for the site in Penzberg from an HR perspective, and then I became the head of HR for all of Germany. And that was an organization which is, I think at the highest point was more than 300 employees, which includes the vocational training departments, which included the occupational health, so the medical doctors on site, and some other functions, classical from recruiting to people development and business partnering and so on and so forth. So I was lucky that I came out of the organization, so I was part of it. So I knew already what was, or at least I thought I knew what was going on. Let's say it that way, right? I had a perception, and I needed to hold myself back and trying to not say this is the truth, but this was my perspective, and now I need to dive into it if that hypothesis I had was true or not. And maybe that's some key learning, that not all what my perspective was from my previous role within the company hold it up to be true. So I had some learnings where I had some biases, how things work, and looking into it a little bit more deeper, that wasn't the case. But there was one bias I had which was confirmed, and I think that is key again, and that's something which is close to my heart, that is focus. I was under the impression we have too many projects running at the same time, as lots of companies have. But when looking into it, there was not an overview how many there were at the same time. So one of the first tasks was for the teams to put together a list, plain list, Excel, whatever. What kind of project do we have? who is on it. So who are the project members, who's owning it, and who was the one, who's the client, or who's the person who benefits from that project. And I think I never got the full list, but when we stopped counting, it was more than 250 initiatives, projects at the same time. 250 for, let's say, for 250 people, 250 projects. And of course, the project always consisted out of 3 to 10 people.
Interdependencies, yeah.
So you're wondering, there's something wrong. So no wonder that we don't finish things early enough, or that it takes 3 years to finish a project because people are not focused. And we cut it down. Originally I said I want to cut it down to just 20, and I was kind of shouted at that this is not possible, and it was not possible. But we cut it down to, I think, 40 or 50 at the end of the day, which were smaller ones, bigger ones, mixed. And that is something where I think I learned a lot, is how much direction do you give and prescribe, and how much freedom do you leave to such an organization, because there was multiple layers. I had a management team who had, again, managers underneath them, and then maybe 2 or 3 levels underneath that. But of course, on that level, I didn't have that insight anymore. I didn't know what, out of these 250, which are highest priority or not. I had no clue. So there again, it comes together. What principle do you create to make teams decide to stop it or not, right? And then that's the leadership aspect we had in place. So what metrics are there, or what numbers maybe, or other kind of points you measure, and give people that hand to say, is it important enough to continue or not? And also going then the tough route on saying the client who ordered this one, no, you're not getting it right now because it doesn't create the value or don't have the capacity. And that's something which worked quite well back then. Which I think also is something, is again, so how much structure do you give, how much direction do you give, but still leaving independence of people to decide on their own based on principles.
That's so top of mind for me as well, because we co-create something similar at a client, a portfolio structure on how to manage projects. And that was really a game changer, because every project needed to be stack ranked. And not you have prio, high, mid, low. You give a rank, and you just can give one number one time. And then you rank them down from 1 to 250, let's say. And to do this ranking and the whole discussion, this is already creating the whole interdependencies, scope, who is the customer, who is benefiting from it, and so on. That is done through that prioritization exercise. And of course, then you need to systemize all the, I would say, attributes and dimensions in a certain way that it's working for that organizational size, for that unit, for that time. And you always need to develop it and iterate on it, because sometimes you start just with the leadership team. Then you need to distribute more information to the team leads. Then also at some point you include ICs. Okay, but how do you then update each other? And how do you make sure that you reiterate on priorities? Because over time something can maybe change. Yeah. Are you still on the right track? That was so fun. And you know what? I had a lot of learnings from that exercise where we co-created this, and I implemented something new into headcount planning for that company. I tested it to say, you don't prioritize positions with high, medium, low, you stack rank the backlog. Any position that the current TA team cannot work on gets a number, and the business partners with the managers together work on their stack ranking every 2 weeks. And then the talent acquisition team is never distracted, because if they take a role, it has highest priority because they work on it. And if we work on that, then you get 100% commitment. Fantastic. But anything else we don't touch. And it worked out very, very well. And suddenly everybody in the organization had clarity of what's next. And it took, I think, 4 weeks that everybody talked to each other, but they had to talk to each other because they needed to decide what is next over another. And suddenly they decided to prioritize not with the delivery teams, but with their peers who impacted from the result of the delivery teams. Outstanding. Simple, but really the results were outstanding.
It's cool that, I mean, it requires, I think, also some courage and discipline how to do it, right? And but if you can implement that and keep it up, have that clarity, I think that's super important, clarity and focus. Fantastic. maybe one learning which I learned, which did not work in such a similar process, because when we didn't stack rank on the one hand side, that was one learning. You probably best to have this backlog being stack ranked. And the other thing is we delegated that to a kind of committee of employees we asked who's interested in. So we said as leadership team, well, we don't want to decide everything. We give that also to people. So why not giving it to a group of people who are closer to that actual work? And then a group of, I think, 6 or 7 colleagues formed. And the idea was every new project goes to that committee first to evaluate it. Where does it belong, stack rank wise, more or less? It didn't work. Didn't work.
Why?
Well, first of all, I think it was unclear. These criteria you said the attributes to measure weren't 100% clear, or they weren't not even close to 100% clear. So it became a longer debate or it was perceived as arbitrary of decisions of what project comes true or not. And then in an environment where a global environment where you're just owning or seeing a piece of it, right? So Roche Germany, yes, 17,000 people, quite big, but in a 100,000 people company, you're still a component of it. So there are sometimes influence from other areas that you do not control or you cannot take into account always. And this kind of made it also difficult for this smaller team to know what's going on overall in this corporation. And sometimes that you had a project coming in that actually didn't fit into your local strategy or even impact, but on a global level, it made perfect sense. So how do you treat these, right? And then at some point, the team was frustrated and then told me, Andreas, it doesn't work. We're spending time here. People are pushing back. We're deprioritizing a project, and then it comes up anyway. So we feel not empowered here. And at that point in time, we realized, okay, it was maybe too early, or maybe we didn't put in the right mechanisms in place. So maybe we should have followed your advice and how you did it with a more rigorous process to define how do we go along with it and before we implement it.
We had the same problem, and the next iteration was exactly to say, to raise a new project, you need to follow a certain pitch document. So you need to pitch the document, and then by pitching it, you are in the mindset of, okay, I make it really well because then it's getting approved and then I can work on it. Not with every project, but with most of them. And suddenly they had a framework of how they need to structure the pitch, which was already the acceptance criteria of all the projects. So you just need to then sit there and say, yeah, makes sense. And where in the stack rank should it be? And then everybody decided or discussed and said, okay, then we put it there. And then everybody knew, okay, in 1 month we will start when this is finished. And then everything is already clear from start to end, from impact. And then you can take that information and brief all the stakeholders. It's not so easy to build because it has a lot of iteration cycles and people involved. And we also did that also more as a consultant side, right? So we were somehow being hired to do so.
And I think that's important. I think that's something, maybe I'm doing some advertising here now for you guys, but trying to do it on your own might be tougher than having somebody with an outside in view, right? Who has a little bit of distance, who's not emotionally connected to the way it worked before. And that's all learnings. I mean, even though we have maybe the brain capacity inside the companies, the perspective is different, and how are you tied to certain things is a different one. So if you have done that and completed that with the client, I can only recommend other colleagues or other people here listening to us maybe to approach you to see how that can be done.
Yeah, cool. And we also just want to start developing, like co-creation, a product from that on how to set up portfolio structures within people teams. Yeah. Because they usually are always oversubscribed, as you say.
So I might come to you then for that too.
Yeah, maybe as a next phase. Is there maybe also somebody you think I should interview next that I don't know yet, but you know?
Well, lots of people. What questions always? What are you looking for? What would be interesting? Well, there's some people coming to my mind, and the question is if you want to have somebody outside of HR or somebody in HR, so outside HR with a view on HR, or somebody within HR.
This will also be interesting because I think that's not just an HR podcast. It started to become one or evolve out of someone, but I like more the overall broader management topics and also having a certain view on the people side, but doesn't have to be all within HR, definitely not.
Yeah. Then I have somebody who I have recommended several times to other people to talk to if they want to have an interesting insights. That is Carsten Linz. Well, maybe that's too SAP heavy, but he used to be a colleague at SAP, but he's long somewhere else. But with a highly interesting perspective on leadership, and I think that's somebody maybe with an interesting insight for the listeners here too.
Yeah, definitely. Because this is also how I like to create my list of people I want to interview, to also just ask the guests, because that's part of the process, in my opinion, to just let it naturally grow.
Cool. I would have more, and I have more, and we can exchange later on. Maybe there's some other colleagues or former colleagues or people I know that could be of interest, depending on which way you want to go.
Yes, definitely. Andreas, I really enjoyed it. Let's maybe wrap it up. What are some final words from your end?
Final words. I think my final words are always difficult, but we talk a lot about principles, and I think that is still a tool which is underestimated, and that companies, regardless of which size or complexity, would benefit of. And not only because it's a mechanism that reduces complexity if you do it right. It also gives you direction and gives people the autonomy to work how they think it's right. It still steers an organization, and that's something I believe we need to put in more out there in an ideally people-centric way. I mean, that's also something I stand for. We haven't talked too much about that today, but putting the person, the individual, in the center and looking at them as a full person, not just as a worker, having that in mind, and then combining it with principles to give direction. I think that creates some high performance in a sustainable way for people and for organizations as well.